I walked outside at 6:02 a.m. with my coffee. There was a backhoe in my orchard. Not near it, in it. Diesel smoke, tyre tracks through 50 years of root systems, a machine operator who wouldn't look at me. I walked straight up to the woman with the clipboard. Get it out, now. She smiled. Didn't move. Said Mr. Fallner, you might want to read page 7 before you finish that sentence. I'd never received any page 7. She knew that. 72 hours to comply. After that, we proceed with or without your cooperation. I looked at the backhoe. I looked at her. I looked at the tree my grandfather planted in 1971. Still standing. For now. Then I said okay. She thought that meant she'd won. It meant I'd just started. What would you do? Drop a pin. Where are you watching from? My name is Garrett Fallner, and I am not by nature a vengeful man. I say that up front because by the time this story ends, you might find that hard to believe. I grew up on this property. 42 acres in the foothills of Western Virginia, an hour east of nowhere, bordered on 3 sides by ridge timber, and on the 4th by a 2-lane county road with a cracked yellow centre line. My grandfather, Earl Fallner, bought the land in 1963. On a postal worker's salary and a second mortgage he never told my grandmother about until it was paid off. He spent the next 20 years turning this rocky, clay-heavy slope into something extraordinary. A working orchard that eventually supplied 3 local restaurants, a farm stand, and enough apple butter to give every neighbour on the road a jar every Christmas, without fail. My father kept it going. I kept it going after him. The trees were old, productive, and deep-rooted in the kind of way that takes decades to build and about 40 minutes to destroy with the right machine. Here's what changed. About 6 years before any of this happened, a developer named Prescott Langley bought the 200 acres on the ridge directly above my property. He wasn't from here. He was from Atlanta. Wore fleece vests in July. Drove a white Range Rover that's always inexplicably clean. And he had ambitions. He built a planned community up there, 62 homes, a clubhouse, a lifestyle amenity package, which as developers speak for a pool nobody swims in and a pickleball court that causes more conflict than it resolves. The community was called Ridgerist Estates. And it came with a homeowners association. The HOA board was chaired by a woman named Dorothea Vance. Dorothea Vance deserves her own paragraph. She was 61 years old, retired from a mid-level HR position at a logistics company in Roanoke, and she had arrived in Ridgerist Estates with the energy of someone who had finally found a domain worthy of her administrative gifts. She wore a lanyard with her board president badge, even when she wasn't at official HOA functions. She had gotten the county assessor's office to resurvey her property line 3 times in 2 years, twice at no cost to her, because she filed the requests as public interest corrections. She had blocked a road widening project because one of the proposed orange cones would temporarily sit 12 inches inside the HOA recorded easement boundary. She was, in the technical sense, exactly the type of person the HOA system was designed to empower. Which is to say, she was exactly the type of person who should never have been given power in the first place. My first interaction with Dorothea came about 8 months before the backhoe showed up. She knocked on my door one October afternoon. The air sharp with the smell of fallen apples fermenting at the base of the trees, yellow jackets drunk on the sweetness, gravel crunching under her sensible shoes. And she informed me, pleasantly but firmly, that Ridgerist Estates had identified a stormwater management issue that required a drainage channel to be routed through the lower portion of my property. She had a letter. She had a map. She had a highlighter. I told her I'd look it over. She said she appreciated my cooperation. I hadn't offered any. I should have read that letter faster. I should have called a lawyer that same week. Instead, I set it on the kitchen counter under a coffee mug and went back to pruning. That decision cost me 11 trees and approximately 18 months of my life. But it also set in motion the most satisfying sequence of events I have ever had the pleasure of engineering. Let me give you the letter's argument, because it's important to understand how Dorothea operated. Always with a veneer of total legitimacy. The letter claimed that Ridgerist Estates had conducted a stormwater study. True, they'd hired a civil engineering firm from Charlottesville. And that study identified my lower pasture as the natural drainage corridor for the ridge. The letter further claimed that under Virginia's common law of drainage, specifically the natural watercourse doctrine, downstream landowners are obligated to accept surface water that naturally flows from uphill properties. That last part is real, by the way. Virginia does recognise the natural watercourse doctrine. Here's the thing, though. It applies to natural drainage patterns that already exist, not to engineered channels that are being proposed for the first time. There's a difference between water that runs downhill on its own and water that a developer has regraded an entire hillside to send in a new direction. Dorothea's letter treated those two things as identical. I still didn't call a lawyer. I wrote back instead, polite, firm, asking for the underlying engineering study, the specific statutory authority they were citing, and the survey documents establishing any easement over my land. Standard stuff. The kind of letter that takes you 45 minutes to write and communicates very clearly. I've done this before and I'm not impressed. Her response came 12 days later, and it was a masterclass in bureaucratic escalation. She had not provided the engineering study. She had not provided statutory authority. What she had provided was a letter from the county's stormwater management office, signed by a deputy director named Phil Haskell, stating that the drainage project was consistent with county development guidelines and that adjacent property owners should be prepared to accommodate necessary infrastructure improvements. That phrase, should be prepared to accommodate, is not a legal requirement. It is, however, exactly the kind of official-sounding language that most people read and immediately fold. Dorothea knew that. She was counting on it. I called my neighbour Walt Briggs that evening. Walt is 73, a retired civil engineer, and the kind of man who has kept every piece of paper he has ever received since approximately 1987. He came over with a thermos of bourbon-spiked coffee. It was November by then. The air bit hard. The last apples clinging to the high branches like they knew something we didn't. And he read both letters slowly, sitting at my kitchen table. That deputy director's letter means nothing, Walt said. It's a courtesy notice, not an authorization. You own that land. They can't run a channel through it without an easement. And they can't get an easement without either buying it from you or condemning it through eminent domain. And a private estate eminent domain. He was right, and that was important. But here's what I didn't know yet. Dorothea had already begun a separate process. While she was exchanging letters with me, she had filed an application with the county to have my lower pasture designated as a stormwater management facility. Under Virginia Code Section 15.221.14, localities can require private landowners to maintain drainage infrastructure on their property if it's been designated as part of a municipal stormwater plan. If that designation went through, the calculus changed completely. I didn't find out about that filing for another 3 weeks. I found out because my neighbour on the other side, a woman named Cecily Drummond who grew lavender and kept bees and had a habit of attending every county planning meeting just because she liked knowing things, called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, casually, as if she were discussing the weather, "Garrett, I see your name on next month's planning agenda." I drove to the county offices the next morning. I pulled the application. I read it, and I felt for the first time in this whole process genuine cold anger. Dorothea had included photographs of my property in her application. Aerial photographs taken from a drone showing the natural low point of my lower pasture. She had annotated them with arrows and labels. She had submitted a drainage flow analysis, the engineering study she'd refused to send me, that modelled the entire ridge's stormwater as funneling through my land. More than that, in the application's narrative section, she had described my orchard as an agricultural operation in decline with limited active management. She had suggested the designation would have minimal impact on current land use. 43 apple trees in active production, supplying 3 restaurants and 2 farmers' markets, and she'd called it a declining operation. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I drove home, called an attorney, and started taking notes. The attorney's name was Breen Ridge Cole, Breck to everyone who knew him. And he operated out of a converted Victorian in the county seat that smelled permanently of old coffee and wood polish. He was 64,